As we near the end of the Skywalker Saga, we already know there are two more Star Wars trilogies headed our way. Both are described as being separate from the Skywalkers, all about new characters and new locations. There's been a lot of speculation that one or both trilogies could take place prior to any of the other films so far, maybe set during the time of the Old Republic. Today I'll be talking about 5 major events that have already been established in the Star Wars canon that I think would make for excellent trilogies. One of the earliest events we can jump back to is the creation of the Jedi Order. The Tarkin novel estimated that the Order began about 10,000 years before the events of the Skywalker Saga, but that has yet to be firmly established. But of course that makes sense to explore. The Jedi have always been front and center in Star Wars storytelling. Even without any familiar characters, the Jedi Order's name alone is recognizable to fans who only watch the Star Wars movies, and seeing the Order begin on Ahch-To is probably interesting enough to pull in the more casual Star Wars fan. What's more is I think that would give us an opportunity to explore some really weird stuff in the Force. The Mortis arc is one of the most memorable in the Clone Wars. The World Between Worlds is one of my favorite episodes of Star Wars Rebels. I think the First Jedi could have some really cool ties to the very mystical aspects of the Force. Or if that were deemed to be too weird for more casual fans, there's still a lot of philosophy to dig into. I'd love to see how the original Jedi saw the Force when compared to the Jedi of the prequel era and beyond. I'm also just a sucker for seeing the same locations in different eras. We've seen what's left of the temple on Ahch-To, but what did it look like when it was fully inhabited? I'd love to know. But moving on, the next major galactic event I can think of is the 100-Year Darkness. That conflict was created in Star Wars Legends, but has been mentioned in one of the canon Star Wars books as the spark that created the Sith Order. I've gotta say, this already sounds like a more likely set of films to me. I would love to see the creation of the Jedi Order, but I'm not sure how exciting that story would be for the average movie-going Star Wars fan. You know what definitely sounds exciting? Seeing a group of rogue Jedi break off from the main order to start their own thing, beginning a civil war within Jedi ranks. Do you remember that shot from the Old Republic cinematics of one red lightsaber igniting and then a bunch of them igniting from the shadows? Tell me you don't want to see something like that on the big screen. We've only ever seen the Sith and the Jedi in their very final days, but what would it be like to see them both at the height of their power, back when the Sith were as great in number as the Jedi and they openly fought? I'll admit the pitch itself sounds a little simple for Star Wars, which has always had something to say about war and conflict, but there's plenty of room for that too. We could see the actual Jedi assault on Malachor, which resulted in the petrification of Jedi and Sith alike. We could see the Jedi learn about the consequences of using their power to fight. I could see this story being a much easier sell to movie-going audiences than the more esoteric creation of the Jedi Order, but I could also see them both happening. The Jedi vs. Sith story sounds like it would be right up Benioff and Weiss's alley, and the more thoughtful, philosophical creation of the Jedi sounds perfect for Rian Johnson. And I think that's okay. I could see one trilogy be more focused on the action and excitement of Star Wars, and then the other trilogy be focused on the mysticism of it all. With 6 movies in the pipeline, Lucasfilm can offer a variety of stories that will speak to different kinds of Star Wars fans, but will hopefully give everyone something to look forward to. But moving on, next in the timeline, we already know that the Mandalorian Wars happened about 5,000 years before the Skywalker Saga. As the Mandalorians spread their territory, conquering planets as they grew, they eventually ran into the Jedi. They didn't understand their enemy's power in the Force, so they developed a lot of their technology we know them for so they could match the Jedi in combat. We also know that despite the fighting, one Mandalorian named Tar Vizsla came to know the Force, join the Order, and create the Darksaber. That right there is a really compelling jumping-off point. What was it like for Tar to be caught between two worlds, to basically abandon his people to join the Jedi? How did the Mandalorians react to that? He eventually became their leader, but what did that look like? Was his return celebrated? Did he have to leave the Jedi Order to do that? How did the Jedi react? There are still a lot of questions surrounding Tar Vizsla that I think would be really cool to explore in the midst of a war between the Jedi and the Mandalorians. Similar to the Sith storyline, Mandalorian armor is insanely recognizable and marketable to even the most casual Star Wars fan. It's entirely possible the two stories could actually be combined as well, since we know the Sith and the Mandalorians collaborated in the past. I will say I think it's less likely that we'll get a Mandalorian-centric trilogy simply because we're already getting a Mandalorian-centric story on Disney+, but I do think there's some interesting stories to be told there. Next up is my least likely scenario, but something I think would be a cool idea. In the Clone Wars Season 3, we visit the Citadel on the planet Lola Sayu. It was originally built as a prison to hold rogue Jedi to avoid anything like the 100-Year Darkness from ever happening again. It remained in use all the way up to the final years before the Clone Wars, although it had transformed from a prison into more of a rehabilitation center, but that still feels kind of icky to me for the Jedi. First, it would be kind of awesome to see an animated location like that appear in live-action form back when it was first created. What would a Jedi-run prison for dark-side users look like? It could be almost like Arkham Asylum for Star Wars, housing a number of terrifying enemies, and eventually, of course, they'd all have to break out and wreak some havoc. I'm not saying we should get a trilogy surrounding just the Citadel, but I think it would be a really cool jumping-off point for some stories. But back to a more likely outcome of exploring the Old Republic era, I saved my most wanted project for last: Darth Bane and the Rule of Two. Darth Bane was a creation of George Lucas from his development of The Phantom Menace and the history behind the Sith Order. The character was mentioned in the novelization for the film, and at least the illusion of his spirit appeared in the Clone Wars. His Legends character design was even considered for inclusion in the Mortis arc of the series. Being a creation of Lucas himself with a pretty solid introduction in actual canon content already makes me really hope we get to learn more about him. Drew Karpyshyan's Darth Bane trilogy of books are some of my favorite Star Wars books in Legends or canon. Early on, he's a sympathetic character, and we understand his reasoning for joining the Sith army at first, and then the Sith Order itself. We get to see how the dark side corrupts a man who had the potential for good into something unrecognizable, which is a story similar to Anakin's, but the reasons behind his fall are very different. That said, if we were to explore Bane's story, I don't think we'd get an adaptation of those books, and I would also be surprised if he were shown to be sympathetic. The Star Wars movies are always pretty black and white when it comes to good and evil. I think Bane would probably take some inspirations from his Legends counterpart, but would wind up being very different. I could see him being a very present leader of the Sith 1,000 years prior to the Skywalker Saga, but the story would probably be told more from the Jedi point of view. The final movie would end with what they think is the destruction of the Sith, but Bane and his apprentice would be shown alive to begin the Rule of Two, and we could get a lot more exploration into that idea, which would feed directly into the Phantom Menace. And not to mention, we'd still be able to get some large-scale Jedi versus Sith battles. But those are my 5 ideas for Old Republic stories. I have no idea what's currently in development over at Lucasfilm. Both trilogies could explore something completely different. But I'm sure we'll start getting into that era sooner or later, and I wanted to look at what we already know about the Old Republic to see what makes sense to use as the framework for a trilogy of films. If you have a different idea for an Old Republic trilogy, let me know in the comments. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and consider checking out our Patreon page. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.